Hey friends, I'm going to do things a little bit differently this time around and add a little bit of commentary to this time lapse. I completed this piece a little while ago. Actually, it was back in December of 2023. I was deep in a campaign with my husband in Baldur's Gate 3, and I was absolutely in love with Karlach. So here I am just layering the alcohol ink markers. It's a mixture again of Copic and Prismacolor because that's just what I own. Working from light to dark, obviously background to foreground. In this instance, I'm going in pretty heavily with a colorless blender in little circles, almost like stippling, to create kind of a blurred background effect. For her skin, I am again working kind of light to dark. Since it's red, layering in kind of peach tones, reds, and oranges to create the tones and textures on her face. You'll have to excuse me, even though I've been live streaming for a long time, I cannot keep the art in one spot and you'll see it move all over the table. Similarly, you'd think that I'd have my camera settings figured out, but you'll see it go in and out of focus. One thing I've learned over the years working in the alcohol ink markers is that you have to be considerate of the strokes that you're making with in this case, I'm using a brush tip marker. The brush tips, where they overlap, you'll see that the pigment is darker, it gets thicker. So you have to kind of learn how to put your marks down so that they don't overlap totally. In some cases it works because that's kind of the texture you're going for. But a lot of times I've just gotten pretty good at, not overlapping my brush strokes. And I think that has just come with a lot of practice. You'll notice in places like the leather she's wearing or her hair that I don't so much mind if the lines overlap because it does start to add to the overall texture of the fabric or of the hair. So it works there, but when you're trying to draw skin or something really smooth or reflective, it just comes with practice of putting it down in a way where your marks don't overlap and kind of add to that overall texture. Now that I have quite a bit of the colors blocked in, you'll notice I start to go in with a little more attention to detail, kind of start drawing in some of the stitching and buttons that I don't do right off the bat. I feel like I did this piece a little bit different than you might normally see me do a piece too, because I started with Karlach's face and eyes, and that's usually something I do last, only because I find that if I start with the most interesting bits first, like faces, eyes, I tend to not want to do what I think is the more tedious or the harder parts, like super textured areas, harder areas, maybe things like architecture or really detailed hair. Those are things I don't find as much joy in doing. So I'll always save kind of the best for last so that I don't get bored or decide that I don't want to finish a piece. Now I'm starting to go in with much darker colors, darker values into the background and into her skin, some browns and greens. I'm also using acrylic gesso to clean up the edges of the portrait. It's also worth noting at this point I've trimmed off the excess cardstock, and the card is now 2.5 inches by 3.5 inches. I don't know why it is, but oftentimes I'll start with something slightly larger, maybe an extra 1/4 of an inch in either direction, and then trim off the excess rather than starting with a card that's 2.5 inches and drawing over the edge. I think maybe it's because the edge of the card starts to get pushed down, and I like having a crisp, clean, white edge on these cards. It doesn't necessarily make sense or stay that way, but that's the way I like to do it. You can see it's a new day, and I set the timer in order to do 5 minutes of uninterrupted work. I'm not sure how well it did, but I at least made a little bit of progress. So we're now at the point where I'm happy with the marker that I've put down, and I'm just adding more details, more value, darker shades, more texture with Prismacolored pencils, and blending that out with a colorless blender. You'll notice that I keep a lot of colored pencils in hand and kind of rapidly switch between them. I don't necessarily think that this is the best way to work, because I'd rather put all of the one color down across the whole piece, then move into the next one, and not work in these little sections like I am, because what I end up having an issue with is the days where I stop working on it and then come back to it. I might not necessarily remember the order in which I applied them, and sometimes I have a difficult time kind of matching up a second day's work to the first day's work. So do as I say and not as I do. And what I would get in the habit of doing is kind of applying the colors in the same order across the whole piece and not just in little sections at a time. At this point, it really is just finishing touches, making sure the form and structure of her face is accurate. So you'll see me really bumping up shadows to contour her face, and highlights, lighter colors like eggshell and white to build up those highlights and higher structure parts of her face. I'll be using a lot of white and eggshell to put in highlights on things like her eyes and her jewelry, and really just spending a lot of time on those fine details. That's when those things are best put in, because everything else is in its place, so I can really start to focus on fine details. You'll notice now that I am not using the white colored pencil, because I've built up too much of that pencil down on the surface and it's not layering anymore. So I introduced some acrylic white gesso to bring in those bright white highlights. I had also kind of messed up her eye and wasn't happy with the way it looked, so I put down a pretty heavy gesso layer on her eye, or not a layer, but I covered up a lot of the original marks that I had made. So the intention is now to go in and kind of fix that eye up once the gesso dries. I try not to go in with a gesso if I don't have to, because it does give a different texture on the paper. So if I'm using it sparingly, and I'm using it consistently. So I want it to be throughout the entire piece. You'll notice that I put it around the whole portrait in that white highlight around her. I put it in both eyes. I put it on some of the jewelry. So then at least it looks intentional and it's not just drawing attention to the mistake that I made. My last step is then going in with my black ink, my fine liners, and touching up any details and outlining anything that needs outlined. that is the very last step, and I try not to do anything else after that. Thank you for watching the video. If you liked the commentary or if you didn't, let me know in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe before heading on out.